Get started. Welcome, everybody. We are so happy you're here. It is our honor tonight to welcome our longtime Temple Sinai congregant, author and filmmaker, Joshua Greene. Joshua is a renowned Holocaust scholar whose biographies have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. A popular lecturer, Joshua has taught at Hofstra and Fordham universities, and he has spoken at the Pentagon, the Judge Advocate General's College. Joshua was also featured in the New York Public Library's Distinguished Author Series. His documentaries on Holocaust history have aired on PBS and Discovery, and Joshua also writes and lectures extensively about spirituality. Tonight, Joshua is going to be speaking to us about his latest book, Unstoppable, Siggi B. Wilzig's astonishing journey from Auschwitz survivor and penniless immigrant to Wall Street legend, a book he spent the better part of a decade researching and writing. We look forward to hearing about this process and about the enduring lessons of resilience and determination we can all learn from Siggi Wilzig's life. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Joshua, and I'm going to turn it over to you and Rabbi White.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here with my good friend, Joshua, who, among many, many gifts, is really an extraordinary teacher, and for me, a really wonderful and nourishing thought partner. And Joshua has written about an eclectic array of topics. But before we get to your current book, Joshua, I'd love you to tell us a little bit about your own personal journey that brought you to specialize in Holocaust studies and Holocaust testimony. And also, if you could speak a little bit about what it has taught you, how it has changed you, and how it has affected your own sense of the world.
Well, I turned 71 this week. So like a lot of other people my age, I was a lost child of the 60s. And in those days, George Harrison was recording Indian devotional music at Apple Studios in London. And on a holiday break from the Sorbonne, where I was studying literature, I went to London and met him and got turned on to yoga and meditation and the Sanskrit scriptures of India, like Bhagavad Gita and others. I came back to the States and finished my formal degrees at Hofstra in religion and philosophy. And in those days, we're talking now the late 90s, my late father-in-law, Alan Fortunoff, was a very active supporter of the Yale University Holocaust Video Archive. Survivor testimony is very effective when recorded as video, because unlike static words on the page, a moving image releases the emotion, the a visual image of memory returning to the surface that are not visible on the pages of a book. So Alan Fortunoff was keen on seeing Holocaust survivor video testimony supported, and he got me involved. At the time, I'd been doing some children's films for PBS and Disney, and the people at Yale said, why don't you help us make a film of some of the early years of survivor testimony and get it on television, and then maybe people will send some money to support what we're doing here. Everyone's sending their money to Spielberg. We could use some help too. So I agreed, and in 2000, a film appeared on PBS called Witness Voices from the Holocaust. And that was kind of the start of a career working with some very distinguished people in the field, Lawrence Langer, the late Professor Jeffrey Hartman, Joanne Rudolph, who was the first archivist at the Yale Archive. And so that's kind of where I cut my teeth, was at the Fortunoff Video Archive at Yale. And after that film aired, the phone kept ringing. It was mostly survivors wanting someone to help tell their story. And for the most part, I declined. But a few things I couldn't walk away from, including the book that brings us here this evening about Siggi Wilzig. So we'll get into why that is, but that's kind of a short answer to your question. As to the second part of your question, how has it changed me? I was tired of people asking me in yoga schools and elsewhere where I'd be teaching about spirituality and meditation. They'd say, how do you reconcile this very beautiful image of the universe that you have with the horrors that took place in Europe 75, 80 years ago? How do you put those two things together in the same worldview? And I did not have a good answer. I didn't know what to say. So when I started working with video testimony, that opened a door to me in a way that the source literature, the print literature, did not. And it helped me to understand some foundational principles of the power of testimony to bring those of us who were not there into the world of those who were there. That was a turning point for me.
How did you get to Siggi?
I guess my grandmother would have said it was beschert. About 8 years ago, the phone rang, and it was Siggi Wilzig's son, Ivan. I didn't know it at the time, but he said, you know, Mr. Greene, I've read some of your books, and I like what you do. I think you were the right person to write my father's story. And he started telling me about Siggi Wilzig and how he had been through forced labor as a young man, and then as a teenager was deported to Auschwitz and survived a dozen selections and 2 death marches, and you know, the litany of horrors once again. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. I don't want to be back in that dark place anymore. And Ivan, you know, who, let's say, he inherited his father's penchant for articulating thoughts at a high volume, you know, basically, you know, very strongly said, no, you don't understand. My father was the light. He wasn't darkness. Even though he went through the darkness, he loved his life. And the more I learned about Siggi, the more I realized this is true. This is an extraordinary person who somehow managed, despite the worst horrors, to be a life lover. He used to get up in restaurants in the middle of a meal and start singing and dancing. Michael, you said we were going to sing a song later, right? Okay, so that would be very Siggi, you know, getting up in the middle of a meal or at a formal program, and you know, if I were a rich man, you know, he just, and people would ask his family, does he own the restaurant or something? They didn't know. He just loves his life.
So I want to commend to all of you, if you haven't yet read it, the wonderful book Unstoppable, which is it's the book that we're going to talk about tonight, and I hope it's actually made into a movie. It's just such an incredibly compelling story, a colorful story, and you tell it so well. Without, and I know that many of the people who are here have read the book, so maybe you could just highlight, you know, some of those moments of Siggi's life that kind of defined him, you know, defined his character and defined his the impact that he made.
You want me to read a couple of pages?
That'd be great.
All right. So this is, he's just arrived in America. It's 1947. He's 21 years old. Hayes has sent him to the Hotel Marseille in Harlem, which is where immigrants in those days were given a start. You could have your own room. It was the first time they had a room in years. Coldest winter on record. What now, he wondered. He had nothing, no resources, no credentials. He spoke with a thick German accent, had only a grade school education, stood 5 feet and 5 1/2 inches short, and years of torture and starvation were still fresh in his mind. Yet here he was, still breathing, staring out the window at snow-covered New York streets. By comparison with the past, everything here was a paradise. The bus ride to Harlem from Ellis Island had been paradise. The neighborhood grocery stores, high-rise apartment buildings, beer trucks, they were all paradise. His smelly room in an overcrowded hotel with cockroaches scurrying across the scuffed hardwood floor, the heavy snowfall outside his window, the 200 remaining dollars in his pocket, which would soon disappear if he didn't find work. It was all paradise. On the street below his window, weary pedestrians fought driving winds and 6-foot-high snowdrifts, evoking for Siggi harsh memories of other blinding storms, when starving men and women trudged forward on death marches wearing nothing more than thin prisoner uniforms. Traffic in the New York streets snarled and drivers honked their horns, impatient to get wherever they were going. Even to a 21-year-old newcomer like Siggi, it was clear that Americans who never knew the inside of a concentration camp were alive in every sense, moving purposefully forward towards some vision of tomorrow. He liked that. He would do that, grasp opportunities and not allow the darkness of the past to rob him of a bright future. In that seminal moment of his new life, Siggi made 3 promises to himself. First, he would never go hungry again. Second, he would marry a Jewish woman, have children, and help rebuild the Jewish people. Third, he would preserve Holocaust memory and speak up whenever he witnessed injustice. He had no illusions about such vows. He knew better than to think he could change the world. Anti-Semitism would never go away, and Jews would always be persecuted. That was just business as usual. Still, the Almighty had saved him, and now his job was to grab whatever scraps remained from the rubble of his life and cobble them back together into an edifice of yet to be determined size and shape.
Wow. And for those who have not yet read the book, and it won't spoil it at all, but why don't you share what the pinnacle of his life? In other words, where he got to from, as one of the jobs he had was sewing bow ties in a sweatshop.
Yeah.
And where did life take him?
All right. So short form trajectory of the life of Siggi Wilzig. He shows up in 1947 with a few dollars in his pocket, no education. The Nazis had closed all schools to Jewish children by the late 30s. He makes these vows. The first jobs he can find, the first is shoveling snow. He earned his first dollar shoveling snow in this blizzard of December of 47. The next jobs he found were in sweatshops, cleaning toilets and sweatshops. Then he graduated, moved up to selling neckties out of the trunk of his car. And with a little bit of money that he earned from commissions, he started buying penny stocks and taught himself how to recognize the signs of a good buy. And so in this little sleepy oil company called Wilshire Oil and Gas of Texas, he saw an opportunity there. By the time he was done, he died of cancer in 2003. He left behind him an oil and banking empire with more than $4 billion in assets. And he was one of the key people in building the Washington Holocaust Museum. He was brought in by his friend Elie Wiesel. He was a spokesperson for Holocaust memory, first survivor to address the cadets and officers at West Point, and dined in the White House with the president. So from cleaning toilets in the sweatshops to dinner with the president in the White House.
Yeah, it is a remarkable story. I was touched in the book by the way faith and theology sort of wove itself through Siggi's life. He belonged to and supported an Orthodox synagogue in New Jersey. He spoke often in sort of theological terms, although I'm not. He wasn't an overly rigorous practicing Jew. He kept kosher, and he did support the synagogue, and he spoke about God. So I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about that sort of, that relationship that he had to Jewish faith that was shaped, textured, colored by his experiences in the Holocaust.
Yeah, that's critically important. He credited his survival, as many who came out of that dark time do, to the hand of God. He says it wasn't because I was a genius. It wasn't because I was so smart or education or anything. It was luck and the hand of the Almighty. For someone who never finished elementary school, this was an extraordinarily brilliant man. There's two kinds of knowledge. There's academic knowledge, acquired knowledge, you might call it. And then there's a kind of intuitive knowledge that can't be taught. There's a way of knowing things that springs from a kind of intuition about the nature of people and the nature of the world. That's the wisdom that Siggi brought to everything he did. There was an insight into how people operate and how things operate that didn't require the formal training. He didn't have the formal training. When I'll give you an example. When and we'll get to the faith in a second. It's all connected. When the oil company was looking to determine whether a new site was worth investing money, it's called spudding a well, where you do a test drill, and depending on the quality and the quantity of what you bring up, the company will decide whether or not to develop that well, to invest more money in. Siggi had no idea about oil and gas. He didn't know the first thing about it. But he would listen to the landsmen. He would listen to the people working that well, and listen to the depth of conviction. If they convinced him that we've seen the evidence here, this one is good, this one is worth investing in, and if he sensed in them the conviction of their knowledge and background and training and education and experience, he would go with it. And he built it. It's not what they teach you in business school, but it worked. It worked extremely well. His faith was so critical to everything he did. I'll tell you a quick story. There was an Israeli businessman who came to see him. This was years later, after he had built Trust Company of New Jersey into the third or fourth largest commercial bank in the state, 100 branches all over, etc. And this man was looking for a loan to start a new business. He was waiting in Siggi's conference room while Siggi finished a meeting in the next room. And the man saw over the mantelpiece Siggi's slogan for life. It was engraved in a marble plaque. It said, "Free men who forget their bitter past do not deserve a brighter future." That was kind of his motto. So Siggi's son, Alan, his younger son, was standing there waiting with this man for his father to come out. And the man turns to Alan and says, remembering the Holocaust in the past, that's no big deal. The better achievement is to forget it and move on. Well, Alan walked into the other room where his father was having the meeting, told him what the man said. Siggi stood up, walked into the conference room, looked at the man and said, best of luck with your project." Slam. That was it. Done. Over. He had no patience for Jews in particular who neglected to remain conscious and aware and perpetuate memory of the Holocaust, not just as a social or generational obligation, but as a spiritual duty. He recognized that there was something so dark unleashed in the Holocaust, and at the same time, something so brilliantly full of light. He used to say that God created Nazis and snakes and spiders. He also created flowers and butterflies. That, I mean, that's a very simple, almost simplistic way of addressing a very profound issue of, theodicy. How do you reconcile an evil universe with a God-centered worldview? And yet for him, that was at the foundation of everything.
Yeah, no, I remember those scenes in the book, and yeah, they really do. There was a passion in him regarding the singularity of the Holocaust, and what he considered to be a preeminent pursuit in terms of preserving and protecting the Jewish people after the Holocaust. Yes. So I want to turn to two other episodes. The first is I'd love you to talk about the construction of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and his role in that. And I'm particularly interested in the ways that that museum nearly got derailed from its core mission. How others sought to universalize the message of the Holocaust, to water down the unique Jewish persecution of the Holocaust, and his role in that, I thought, very interesting saga.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. I don't know how many people actually are aware of the background to the Washington Museum and how it almost didn't happen. Many times, actually. Sometimes for just technical reasons. The original building that had been allocated it turned out to be unsafe. The wood had deteriorated from age and from infestations and so on. So they had to start from scratch to build a new museum. Even more challenging to the reality of the Washington Holocaust Museum were thematic issues, editorial issues. Should this be a Jewish museum, closed on the Sabbath, or should it be an American museum open 7 days a week? Should the words of Adolf Hitler be engraved on the walls somewhere, or is that a travesty? Many issues like that. Would an exhibit of human hair be too disturbing to museum goers? Many issues like that. Without question, the single most contentious issue was whether this should be an exclusively Jewish experience, meaning some members of the Museum Council, as it was called, that was founded in the late 70s to oversee the development of the museum. Some members felt that there should be other genocides brought in. Why? Well, for one thing, to make the experience more relevant to young people. Right? That was one argument. Another argument was, should we not also honor the many other minorities and peoples other than the Jews who were tortured, starved, humiliated, destroyed, murdered, etc., by the Nazis? For Siggi and for a majority of members on the council, that was anathema. That was unacceptable. The very idea of denying the Jewish specificity of the Holocaust by broadening out away from this Jewish core to include other genocides was for him unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable. His point was, where's it going to end? Where's it going to, you want to bring in, this is interesting. When I was teaching at Hofstra, if someone was teaching a course on the African-American experience, the African-American history, no one stood up and said, if we're going to have a course on the history of the African-American people in America, we should also be talking about the history of the Irish. We should also be talking about the history of the Italians. We should also be talking. No one says that. Somehow it's reserved for the Holocaust. You know, there have been many Holocaust study centers around the country over the years. You're aware of this more than anybody, that have changed their name. It's now Holocaust and Genocide Studies. It's Holocaust and Human Rights Studies. It's Holocaust, moving away, getting broader. Why? I mean, you know, there are theories about this. Is it because people are afraid of drawing too much attention to the Jewish people and therefore being accused of trying to garner sympathy for the state of Israel? I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why people would do this. But for Siggi, that was absolutely the idea was intolerable. He would not allow that to happen.
I want to talk a little bit about his connection to politics. One of the things that struck me about his connection to politicians was that it really wasn't partisan. It's hard to think about his approach to supporting political candidates today, given how bifurcated politics are today. But he supported politicians who he felt would benefit him in terms of his business, but also he only supported politicians who were supportive of the state of Israel. And that was a critical factor for him. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, but I'm also really interested in your discussing his relationship with Ronald Reagan and Reagan's visit to the cemetery in Germany.
Right.
Because that's such a fascinating episode.
Sure. No, you're right to point these things out. Remember, this was someone who came from nothing. His family was not a particularly influential family. He grew up in Krojanka, a small village in West Prussia. There were maybe 1,500 Jews and one synagogue. And you know, he was 14 years old when he was sent to work in a Nazi munitions factory in the suburbs of Berlin. And then a few years later, along with his family and the other Jews of Berlin, deported to Auschwitz in 1943. Spent 2 years in Auschwitz. Then was sent on a death march to Mauthausen. From Mauthausen to Melk, and then from Melk back to Mauthausen, so 2 death marches really. And then was liberated in April by the American forces from Mauthausen. Weighed 86 pounds or something like that. And had nothing except sheer moxie, which is to say he had everything. Because when he got here, look, this was someone who never allowed bullies to beat him down. This is not someone who allowed his short stature, you know, 5'5" and a little, to ever be a deficit. This was someone who understood the power of language and became absolutely Shakespearean in the way he would speak, and recognized the importance of allegiances. So that, for example, we talked about how he didn't have to have the formal training. He would find the people with the formal training in oil and gas, banking, finance, whatever it might have been, and get them to make the hard decisions that he didn't have the background to make. He used every opportunity that came his way to build a base from which his voice could be heard. This was the thing. He wanted to speak out and recognize, look, this was someone who had seen the power of demagoguery. He had seen the power of rhetoric to weaponize an entire people, right? And if this is ringing some bells for you right now, not a big surprise. This was someone who understood that, you know, words are like weapons, and if they're used properly, they can do immense good. So he came here and he would watch the History Channel. He would learn the language and the phrases and craft the way he would present things to a point where he was absolutely mesmerizing, and could suss out who are the politicians who are most supportive of Israel. And he would, to them, he would deliver the Jewish vote. You know, when you've got a bank with 100 branches, you know, and contacts with, you know, most businesses in the state, you can have some influence on how people vote. And he used that wisely to bring support whenever possible to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel.
Yeah, there's one line in the book, something to the effect of one of the members of Congress that he supported said, if you want to get elected in New Jersey, you have to go through Siggi.
Gotta go through Siggi.
Yeah. So talk about Reagan and
yeah.
Bitcoin.
All right. So here's the deal. I think it was early 80s. Reagan decides that he has to visit Bitburg Cemetery, that he owes it to his friend, the Prime Minister of Germany, to honor the young German men who died in World War II. And his argument was, his reasoning was, were they not also duped by the Nazis? Were they not also victims of Hitler? And it was the most backwards, dangerous thinking that has ever happened in office. And Siggi had a friend, Barry Farber. Maybe some of the people, some of your congregants will remember radio talk show host Barry Farber. At one time, his show was the most popular radio show in America. Barry had Siggi on his show several times. And the last time was just prior to Reagan's visit to Bitburg Cemetery, where SS officers were buried. And Siggi was livid, absolutely livid about, you know, if Reagan had been some kind of a stupid person or, you know, just didn't know what he was talking about, I wouldn't be so disturbed, but he's not. He's a intelligent man. He's the president of the United States, and he does not recognize what he's doing. He says, this is the worst nightmare I've had since leaving Auschwitz, that an American president would dignify the people responsible for murdering 59 members of my family, including a niece and a nephew, young children. He said, I tried to get a message through to him. I said, look, go visit the grave of Rommel, you know, a soldier's soldier. At least he never marched children to their death in gas chambers. And for me, that was an important incident to include in the book, because it showed the extent of this man's energy when he felt that the Jewish people were being dealt with unjustly.
Yeah.
He was fearless. This man was fearless. The Forbes magazine did a profile of Siggi Wilzig, and they closed their profile. It was like a 3-page article saying, describing how Siggi was suing the Federal Reserve because the Fed wanted him to divest one of his 2 companies. They said oil and banking, that's a conflict of interest. So you got to get rid of your companies. Siggi refused to do it. So Forbes says, what's the Fed when you've stared down the Gestapo? So he was fearless, absolutely fearless. And so he he challenged the president. He said, don't do this. Elie Wiesel went to the White House to receive, I think, the Medal of Honor, turned around and surprised everyone by saying to President Reagan, that place is not your place. Do not go there. Please find some other way to show your solidarity with Germany.
Yeah.
But by then it was too late.
So I'm just going to ask you 2 more questions, and then we can open it up to the floor. The first question I want to ask you is that Siggi was, like all of us, flesh and blood and flawed. You paint a very transparent picture of his relationship with his family. and the way he treated his children, the way he often treated employees, his requirement for absolute unconditional loyalty, also from his customers and from his clients. And when you do that, in your interviews with the people who were the victims of this behavior, they often excuse it by saying, well, he went through the camps. So this is a manifestation of what he suffered through when he was living through the Holocaust. And as I was reading it, Joshua, I wanted to hear your judgment of that. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, about his relationship with his family in particular, with his children, and also in all of its expressions, including the worst, and the way they felt that the Holocaust was the source of this bad behavior, and what you think about that.
Well, the first thing I would say is let's not call them the victims of his behavior. I think that's a little perhaps a little extreme. His intentions were never to hurt people. His intentions were to help people. He did so à haute voix, with a strong voice, and people didn't always understand that it was for their good, for their benefit, and so some people took offense at it. If you understood the man, if you understood what his intentions were, then you weren't offended by the yelling. Yelling for Siggi Wilzig was like you and me, making a point by tapping the table with our finger for emphasis. It was his way of emphasizing something important. And his point generally was, don't be a schmuck. That was his favorite word. He loved calling everybody a schmuck. You're a schmuck. What do you think you're doing, you schmuck? What's a schmuck? What did he mean by that? He meant, don't be foolish. Don't be stupid. Don't you understand? I've got more experience in this than you do, and I'm looking out for your interests. Why do you have your money in 5 different banks? I told you, consolidate all your money here so that I can give you better interest. I can do investments for you. Schmuck, don't you understand? I'm trying to help you. So it was with the best of intentions. Right? Where did that, look, I'm not an analyst. I don't want to pretend to go into the psychology of a Holocaust survivor and try to pretend to know why he did what he did and how he did it and when it occurred and so on. I think what we can say is that he had clearly been damaged by his experiences. This is someone who saw what human beings were capable of doing to one another. And I don't think it's possible for anyone to be exposed to the horrors of Auschwitz for 2 years and not come away from that damaged in some degree. And so, certainly to grow up as the child of someone who has those kinds of nightmares every night of his life could not have been an easy thing. And, Ivan and his sister Sherry and their younger brother Alan were all very candid with me. I must say they were very honest and very open about what it was like for them. And it was not easy. I mean, goodness gracious, they did not have an easy time. But never, ever did they doubt their father's love for them. Never, ever did they doubt that what he did was for their benefit. And maybe that's where this, existential tension comes from. In India, there's a saying, try drinking hot sugarcane juice. It's too sweet to give up, but it's too hot to bear. It's like that. It's like something sweet, but so intolerably hot at the same time. And yet somehow they all emerged extraordinary people. I mean, it's been my privilege to work with Siggy's children on this book. They're brilliant. I mean, the way they analyzed, truly, Ivan and Sherry in particular, they read every word, every paragraph, every page over and over and over just to make sure everything was done properly. First of all, because we're dealing with the Holocaust, and they knew you don't get anything wrong when you deal with the Holocaust. Get it right. So we went through many different, advisors and editors and readers just to make sure that, we could do the very best job we could. So look, you're asking me a very difficult question. I don't think I could have done this book if ultimately I didn't have the deepest respect for this man. In fact, I didn't want to do the book. Initially I'd done enough Holocaust biographies. I mean, you know this better than anybody. Maybe a dozen biographies of men, women, children who'd come out of that period. I was done. I just didn't want it anymore. In Siggi, I found someone who embodied a lot of the same kind of character traits that I'd like to develop for myself. Immense integrity, great sense of humor, extraordinary creative abilities, noble intentions, brilliant analytical skills. I mean, this was quite a unique human being. The $4 billion in assets, as far as I'm concerned, that was just icing on the cake. The fun stuff about this book is all of the fun, the crazy sense of humor and the outrageous tales that he would tell to win friends and build his company.
So my last question, Joshua, is not about Siggi, but it's about you and this book in this time when we are seeing a rise of propaganda that becomes transmogrified into violence, where we see a rise of white nationalism and anti-Semitism. And so I'd love you to share how you hope and think the lessons of this book and your other work can help us to make some sense out of the time we're living in, and maybe serve as a bit of a remedy to the time we're living in.
No pressure. I get it. If Siggi were here, his response would be teach the Holocaust, study the Holocaust, never stop teaching the Holocaust, never stop learning about the Holocaust. That there's a key there somewhere. And while we're 75, 80 years into our analysis of the Holocaust, there's a lot more we need to learn and a long way to go. We need to understand the Holocaust and study the details of the Holocaust because something was unleashed there, something very dark in human nature. And Michael, what you're pointing to, and I kind of knew we were going to get to this sooner or later. That's just kind of that's how we roll. When you and I are together, we end up bring it all in. You remember the footage of the guy on January 6th storming the Capitol with a sweatshirt and the words Camp Auschwitz on the sweatshirt? Okay. Hatred and racism and anti-Semitism didn't die with Hitler in his bunker. They're at the heart of the anger and the murderous actions that we've been seeing for these many months. And it is a deep, dark force. What have I learned? I've learned that it is not unspiritual to be prepared to retaliate. Let me unpack that a little bit. When I was young and beautiful and naive, I used to think being spiritual meant no violence, don't retaliate, some naive Gandhian, sense of nonviolent response to things. And what I've learned, I think, and certainly from doing this book and from recent events, is that if you do not respond when you are aggressed upon, that doesn't make you spiritual, that makes you stupid. And, for an old hippie like me, it's a little hard to get my arms around that idea, that there's a right way to conduct armed conflict. There are these two things in international law. One is called necessity and the other is called humanity. Necessity says that if an enemy approaches, you have the right to do whatever you need to do to defend your person, your family, your home, your place of worship, your possessions, your homeland. You can do whatever you need to do to respond to aggression. Humanity says that in that response, you may not perform any more harm than absolutely necessary. And these are the two regulating considerations on the fulcrum on which international law has been balancing since the Nuremberg trials. And it's been a real wake-up call for me to recognize that I've been naive. I've been naive in thinking that if I could just find the right words, I can get through to anybody. If I can touch their hearts. I mean, the worst kind of dribble, that used to really kind of lie, that was the ethos of my life. I really believe that there's, hope for pure goodness alone, and we can turn this ship around. We can get back on course. Well, the last 4 or 5 years have, if nothing else, they've taught me that that's stupid, dangerously naive. And you better be prepared to fight if you have to. And do not see that as some kind of a defeat of your noble aspirations for a more enlightened civilization. It is a necessary step toward that goal. That's been a real rude awakening, a real shocker for me.
Well, thank you, Joshua. I've loved everything you've said, and now we've got some questions from the group, right, Adrienne?
We do indeed. Thank
Great.
you both so much for this wonderful and enlightening conversation and inspirational conversation. A few questions for you, Joshua, and folks, I'll say this is the last call. If you'd like to type anything into the chat, now would be the time to do it. Someone asked, how and when did Siggi first share his personal story with the public? In other words, how long after the war ended?
The first week he arrived in America, he made good on a promise he'd made to a young man 6 years older than himself, who had been his best friend in Auschwitz, a boy named Lothar Nartelski, changed his name later to Larry Nartel. He told Larry that when he got to America, because Siggi got his visa before Larry did, when he came to America, he would find Larry's parents, who lived in the New York area. They lived up in the Bronx. And he would tell them, the story, reassure them that their son is alive, and then tell them what happened. So the first time he told something of what had occurred to him, he was 21 years old, is when he first arrived. But it wasn't really, and ever since then, he would take every opportunity given him to tell what happened. Some survivors didn't talk about it. If you were obliged to do things that were, humiliating, embarrassing, you may not want your grandchildren to know what you had to do, to stay alive. Siggi flat out used every opportunity he could to talk about the Holocaust, to support Holocaust memory, to preserve the experiences of what happened. Now, some things he didn't talk about until almost, within a few weeks, even of when he passed away in 2000. He died in 2003. So the Shoah Foundation sent a camera crew to his apartment in New Jersey in late 2002. And they ended up recording more than a dozen hours of testimony. It was one of the longest testimonies in the Shoah Foundation archive. And he told some stories then that I don't think he had told previously. But every opportunity he had,
Thanks, Joshua. Someone asked, what did he do with his estate?
Well, his youngest child, Alan, took over as president of the Trust Company Bank after Siggi was no longer able to fulfill that function. He was under some very heavy medication for multiple myeloma. And so by the end of 2001, early 2002, he didn't go back to the bank after that. He was pretty much in his apartment. And the family, inherited his shares of the bank and Wilshire Oil. And they've gone on to do some extraordinary philanthropic work with their inheritances. My main contact, Siggy's son Ivan, founded what's called the Peaceman Foundation, which is to help victims or those with PTSD and underrepresented groups, LGBTQ initiatives. Sherry, I don't think I've ever met anyone as charitably disposed as Sherry. She spends her days caring for people who don't have family, Holocaust survivors who may need medicines or whatever. She's there for them. Alan has supported Jewish projects, raised Jewish children. I mean, it's an amazing family. So Siggy's accumulated wealth is being well used, well engaged by his children.
Beautiful. And someone asked, what kind of book do you look forward to working on in the future? And I guess I would add as an addendum to that, are you currently working on your next book? And if so, can you share anything about that with us?
I am working on a book. It's not quite in the same arena. It's about a saint from 15th century Bengal named Chaitanya, who was the founder of the mantra meditation movement. He was one who brought the chanting of sacred mantras as a spiritual discipline into the public purview. You might say that one's a bit of a niche book. And after that, I don't know. I'm still catching my breath. Unstoppable has taken 8 years, and it's doing very well. I can think it's #1 on Amazon and Jewish biographies right now. But I'm still catching my breath from that. So ask me next week.
Okay, we'll get back to you on that. Another question that came in is basically, which of the issues that you discussed vis-a-vis the Holocaust Museum in DC followed Siggy's vision? In other words, how did the Holocaust Museum handle his preferences for things as opposed to, in terms of not including other groups who were impacted by the Holocaust, Roma, for instance, and things like that? The museum, not, or possibly yes, being open on Shabbat and things like that. How did they accommodate his wishes?
I think Siggy had a very strong impact on the policies, editorial, administrative, and otherwise, of the Washington Museum. They did not bring in other genocides. It did not, the Holocaust is not an example of something else. It is the wall against which everything is measured. The Holocaust is not an example of man's inhumanity to man. The Holocaust is not some kind of genocide. The Holocaust was the state-sponsored, scientifically designed, systematic torture, starvation, and murder of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and their allies. And there's no arguing that. And Siggy managed to, with the support of many other council members and others, maintain the integrity of that message at the Washington Museum.
Thanks so much, Joshua. Rabbi White, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, this has been a wonderful, wonderful session, Joshua, as I knew it would. We all learned a great deal from you. And again, I commend the book Unstoppable to everyone who is here, and to all of your friends. It's really, it's such a moving, inspiring, challenging piece of biography. And I want to really encourage all of you to read it. But I think tonight, Joshua, we learned a lot more than what's in the book from you. And you taught us much about the role of Holocaust testimony in the Jewish experience, in the human experience. You taught us from a theological perspective. You taught us from a contemporary perspective. I'm just grateful always to be able to learn from you and to be able to enable our community to learn from you as well. And so thank you. Thank you for a great evening. And to the rest of you, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you, Rabbi White, and thank you to all our Sinai folks, as always, for being here. If folks want to unmute just to say a quick hello, you should be able to do that now.
And thank you, Adrienne, for your masterful Zoom mastering.
Oh,
As always.
it's a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank
Josh.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for providing the books to so many of us.
Very
That
well.
was a wonderful gesture.
Thank you. You're welcome.
This is really terrific.
Right.
Good night, everyone. Take care and be
Say
well.
hi
to
Esther.
Thank
Joshua, thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.